You think your heating bill is bad? Try surviving a Soviet winter where temperatures hit -40, fuel shortages were constant, and the government expected you to show up for work anyway. The strategies ordinary Soviet citizens developed weren't just clever, they were the difference between life and death. And what they figured out will completely change how you think about cold weather survival. When winter descended on the Soviet Union, it didn't mess around. We're talking about a climate so brutal that Hitler's entire army literally froze to death trying to conquer it. But here's the thing. While Nazi soldiers were dying in the snow, Soviet citizens were going about their daily lives, working in factories, standing in bread lines, and somehow not freezing solid. How did they do it? The answer involves some seriously ingenious tricks that modern survival experts still study today. Let's start with where Soviet people actually lived. Forget those cozy wooden dachas you see in movies. Most urban Soviets were packed into massive concrete apartment blocks called Khrushchevkas or Brezhnevkas, depending on which era built them. These buildings looked depressing from the outside, but their design was actually brilliant for winter survival. The concrete walls were thick, and I mean seriously thick, sometimes over a foot of solid material. Why? Because Soviet engineers understood that thermal mass was your friend. Those massive concrete slabs absorbed heat during the day and released it slowly at night, creating a natural temperature buffer that kept apartments from turning into iceboxes the second the sun went down. But here's where things get interesting. Soviet buildings used a centralized heating system called teplo. One massive boiler heated an entire neighborhood through underground pipes that pumped scalding water through radiators in every apartment. Sounds great, right? Except when it wasn't. The system ran on a government schedule, typically October 15th to April 15th, regardless of actual weather. Early October blizzard? Too bad, freeze until the official start date. Warm spell in March? Enjoy sweating in your apartment because nobody's turning off the heat until mid-April. The radiators themselves became multi-purpose survival tools. Soviet families didn't just use them for warmth. They dried clothes on them, cooked on them during gas shortages, and even used them as makeshift humidifiers by placing water-filled pans on top. Every surface that generated heat got weaponized for survival. Then there's the window situation. Soviet apartments had double or even triple-paned windows, but the seals were often garbage, so citizens got creative. They'd stuff gaps with cotton wool, newspaper, or strips of foam rubber. Some people went full overboard, creating elaborate paper strips glued with flour paste to seal every microscopic crack. This process became an annual autumn ritual that entire families participated in. But wait, it gets better. Smart Soviet residents hung heavy curtains that reached from ceiling to floor, creating dead air spaces that worked as thermal barriers. Some families even nailed blankets over doorways leading to colder rooms, essentially abandoning parts of their apartments during the worst winter months. Why heat rooms you're not using when fuel and heat are precious resources? The strategy was simple but effective. Concentrate your warmth in the spaces you actually lived in and let the rest of the apartment turn into an ice locker if necessary. Soviet people mastered the art of clothing layers in ways that would make modern outdoor enthusiasts jealous. This wasn't fashion. This was calculated thermal engineering using whatever materials you could actually find in stores, which wasn't much. The foundation started with telnyashka, those striped undershirts, originally designed for sailors. Soviet citizens wore these as base layers year-round because they understood something crucial. Cotton next to skin, then wool, then windbreaking outer layers. Each layer trapped air, and trapped air meant trapped warmth. Then came the wool. Soviet women knitted constantly on buses during lunch breaks while watching TV. Hand-knitted wool sweaters, scarves, mittens and socks became essential survival gear. Store-bought clothes were often poor quality, but Grandma's hand-knitted sweater. That thing could survive nuclear winter. Wool from Soviet sheep breeds was particularly coarse and thick, perfect for extreme cold, even if it was itchy as hell. The genius was in understanding that multiple thin layers worked better than one thick layer because air got trapped between each piece of clothing. Let's talk about the ushanka, that iconic fur hat with ear flaps. This wasn't a fashion statement or tourist souvenir. This was serious survival equipment. The design covered your ears, forehead and neck, all critical areas where you lose massive amounts of body heat. Real ushankas used rabbit, muskrat, or sheepskin fur that created incredible insulation. Losing your ushanka in winter was basically a medical emergency. People treated these hats with the same reverence they'd give valuable jewelry because in many ways they were more valuable than jewelry. You can't wear a gold necklace to prevent frostbite. Footwear tells the real story, though. Soviet winter boots called valenki were made from thick, felted wool. They looked like grey felt boots your grandmother would wear, but they kept your feet warm in temperatures where leather boots turned into frozen torture devices. The trick was wearing them with portyanki, foot wraps, instead of socks. Soldiers and workers swore by these because they didn't bunch up, absorbed moisture better, and could be repositioned to avoid pressure points during long shifts in the cold. Modern hikers spend hundreds on technical socks, but Soviet citizens achieved the same result with strips of cotton cloth wrapped correctly. Outer layers were all about windbreaking. The quilted jacket called vatnik became iconic Soviet workwear. These jackets had cotton wool padding between layers of canvas, creating a portable insulation system that blocked wind while trapping heat. Were they stylish? Absolutely not. Did they work? Ask anyone who survived Siberian winters. The padding was so effective that factory workers could spend entire shifts outdoors in -30-degree weather and return home without frostbite. The key was that the outer canvas blocked wind completely while the inner cotton wool trapped body heat like a thermos traps hot coffee. When you're dealing with food shortages, rationing, and winters that lasted 6 months, your kitchen became mission control for survival operations. Soviet families developed food preservation and preparation techniques that were honestly brilliant given their limited resources. Storage was everything. Soviet apartments had what people called a refrigerator outside the window. People built insulated boxes that hung outside their windows in winter, using the freezing temperatures as natural freezers. Why waste electricity when Mother Nature provides sub-zero storage for free? These window refrigerators kept food frozen solid from November through March. You'd simply open your window, reach into the box, and grab whatever you needed. Free freezer that never broke down and never consumed electricity. But here's where it gets interesting. Soviet families became masters of fermentation and pickling. Summer and autumn were spent preserving everything possible for winter consumption. Cabbage became sauerkraut in massive jars. Cucumbers were pickled with dill and garlic. Tomatoes, mushrooms, even watermelons got preserved in brine. These weren't just snacks, they were vitamin sources during months when fresh vegetables didn't exist. Scurvy was a real threat during long Soviet winters, and these preserved vegetables provided the vitamin C that kept people healthy when fresh produce was impossible to obtain. Canning was practically a national obsession. Soviet women closed jars with military precision. Jams, stewed fruits, vegetable preserves and meat conserves filled pantries until apartments looked like amateur grocery stores. This wasn't hoarding. It was rational preparation for guaranteed winter scarcity. Every family knew that come January, stores would have empty shelves and long lines for basic goods. Having your own stockpile meant the difference between eating regularly and going hungry until spring deliveries resumed. Then there's the potato situation. Potatoes were the foundation of Soviet winter survival. Families stored hundreds of kilograms in cellars, basements, or heated balconies. Potatoes provided calories, vitamins, and could be prepared 1,000 different ways when other foods weren't available. Run out of potatoes in January, you were in serious trouble until spring shipments arrived. Soviet citizens ate potatoes at nearly every meal during winter. Boiled potatoes for breakfast, potato soup for lunch, fried potatoes for dinner. Monotonous? Absolutely. But it kept you alive and provided the calories needed to generate body heat. Root vegetables got buried in sand in cellars, carrots, beets, turnips. This old-world storage method kept them fresh for months without refrigeration. Soviet citizens maintained these underground cellars with the same care. They'd give valuable property because that's exactly what it was. The sand prevented the vegetables from touching each other, which stopped rot from spreading, and the cool but not freezing temperature of the cellar kept everything fresh without turning it into a frozen brick. Cooking methods adapted to winter scarcity too. The burzuika, a portable iron stove, saved countless lives during fuel shortages. During the worst winters, particularly after World War II and during economic crises, families cooked on these improvised stoves, burning whatever they could find: furniture, books, fence posts. Desperate times demanded desperate measures. These stoves weren't efficient or clean burning, but they worked when official heating systems failed. People would set them up in the middle of their apartments, run a chimney pipe out a window, and cook meals while simultaneously heating their living space. Here's something Western survival guides rarely mention. Soviet people survived winter through forced but effective community cooperation. And I mean actually forced. Your neighbors knew everything about your life because walls were thin, space was limited, and privacy was a luxury nobody had. Communal apartments housed multiple families sharing one kitchen and bathroom. Sounds like a nightmare, and often it was. But during brutal winters, this arrangement meant shared resources and shared body heat. 20 people living in one apartment generated significant warmth just through their collective presence. The combined heat from their bodies, cooking and daily activities kept temperatures survivable even when official heating failed. Building communities operated on unwritten survival codes. If Grandmother Ivanova on the 5th floor hadn't been seen for 2 days during a blizzard, neighbors checked on her. Not out of pure kindness, though that existed too, but because frozen corpses in apartments created problems for everyone. Collective survival meant nobody got left behind to freeze. Dead bodies meant investigations, paperwork, and potential problems with authorities. Better to prevent the situation by checking on vulnerable neighbors regularly. The dvornik, the building superintendent, became crucial during winter. These weren't just janitors, they were survival coordinators. Dvorniks cleared snow from entrances, kept boiler rooms running, and knew which apartments had elderly residents who needed checking on. A good dvornik meant the difference between a functional building and a frozen death trap. They had keys to every apartment and weren't shy about using them if they suspected someone was in trouble. Privacy concerns took a back seat to survival concerns during the coldest months. Then there's the subotnik, voluntary community workdays. During winter, entire apartment buildings turned out to clear snow, repair heating systems, and winterize buildings. Yeah, it was mandatory voluntary work, but it kept everyone alive. Shovel snow as a collective, or freeze individually, not really a choice. These workdays also served social functions, bringing communities together and allowing people to identify who needed extra help. The elderly man who couldn't shovel his share of snow. Young neighbors quietly did it for him without making a big deal about it. Work collectives extended survival networks beyond neighborhoods. Soviet factories and offices operated on brigade systems where co-workers became surrogate families. If someone was struggling financially or couldn't afford winter clothes, the brigade quietly helped. Factory workers borrowed extra materials to weatherproof apartments. Office workers shared food during shortages. The system was corrupt, but it kept people alive. Your work collective knew when your kid needed a warmer coat, and somehow a slightly used one would appear in your locker with no questions asked about where it came from. Public spaces became winter survival hubs. Libraries, metro stations, and House of Culture buildings were heated by government mandate. During the worst cold snaps, people who couldn't heat their apartments spent entire days in these warm public spaces. Nobody questioned it because everyone understood the alternative was freezing to death. Pensioners would arrive at the library when it opened in the morning and stay until closing, reading newspapers and books in the warmth. Students studied in heated metro stations. Workers extended their lunch breaks in factory cafeterias. The unspoken agreement was that as long as you weren't causing problems, nobody would chase you out into the cold. Let's talk about the banya, the Russian bathhouse. This wasn't some luxury spa experience. This was critical winter survival infrastructure that modern people completely underestimate. Soviet apartments often had limited hot water, especially during winter when heating systems were overtaxed. The banya provided a place to actually get clean and warm once a week, but it was so much more than that. The extreme heat, we're talking 80 to 100 degrees Celsius, fundamentally warmed your body's core temperature in ways that regular heating couldn't match. Here's where it gets interesting from a survival standpoint. The heat from a good banya session stayed with you for days. Your body's core temperature elevated, improving circulation and making you more resistant to cold. Soviet doctors actually prescribed banya visits for winter health maintenance. Not folk medicine, actual medical advice, because it worked. The intense heat, followed by the traditional cold plunge or snow roll, created a shock to your system that improved your body's ability to regulate temperature in extreme conditions. The social aspect mattered too. Banya visits became community bonding time where people shared information, resources, and survival strategies. You learned which stores had firewood, whose cousin could get extra coal, which building superintendent was actually competent. Critical winter survival intelligence got traded in the steam room. Men and women went on separate days or times, creating gender-specific information networks that supplemented the mixed gender networks of work and neighborhood life. Soviet history had periods when the entire system collapsed after World War II, during the economic crisis of the 1990s and various regional disasters. These moments revealed the true extent of Soviet survival skills. The blockade, the siege of Leningrad during World War II, represents the absolute extreme of winter survival, and over 800 days, citizens survived winters with no heat, no food, and constant bombardment. They burned furniture for warmth, ate wallpaper paste for calories, and somehow didn't all freeze or starve. The survival techniques developed during the blockade became legendary, insulating walls with paper, creating tin can stoves, sharing body heat in public shelters. People discovered that certain types of wallpaper paste contained organic starches that, while not nutritious, at least provided something for the stomach to process. They learned which books burned longest and provided the most heat per page. They figured out that sharing beds with multiple people, even strangers, was preferable to sleeping alone and risking freezing to death. These weren't pleasant choices, but they were survival calculations made by people who refused to die. During the 1990s collapse, when the Soviet Union fell apart, heat and electricity became unreliable even in major cities. Families reverted to older survival methods: wood-burning stoves, kerosene heaters, and layering every piece of clothing they owned. Pensioners who remembered pre-Soviet winters taught younger generations forgotten skills: how to bank fires properly, which mushrooms and berries to forage even in winter, how to stretch food supplies when stores were empty. The knowledge transfer happened urgently because people were literally freezing in their apartments when centralized heating systems failed. Entire apartment buildings organized themselves into survival cooperatives. Residents pooled money to buy fuel for boilers. They organized roving night watches to keep boilers running and prevent theft of heating equipment. They shared whatever food they had, knowing that a neighbor who starved to death was one less person to help keep the building functional. The individualism that arrived with capitalism nearly killed people who'd grown up depending on collective survival strategies. Here's the thing about Soviet winter survival that no list of techniques can fully capture: the mentality. Soviet people didn't view winter as something to avoid or escape. It was simply reality that you endured because what other choice existed? You couldn't flee to Florida for the season. You couldn't even complain too loudly without risking problems with authorities. This created a culture of acceptance, combined with relentless problem-solving, window leaking cold air, stuff it with newspaper, radiator broken, figure out how to cook on a makeshift stove, no warm clothes available in stores, learn to knit. The combination of resourcefulness and stoic endurance defined Soviet winter survival. Soviet people also understood something we've forgotten. You don't need comfort to survive, just adequate warmth and calories. Western standards of indoor heating would have seemed wasteful and unnecessary. Wearing multiple sweaters indoors was normal. Sleeping under heavy blankets in a cold bedroom was expected. The goal wasn't comfort, it was survival. Modern Americans keep their homes at 72 degrees year-round and still complain about being cold. Soviet citizens lived in 55-degree apartments and considered themselves lucky if they had that much warmth. The weird part is how these survival skills are disappearing now. Modern Russians with central heating, online shopping, and imported winter gear don't possess the same hard-scrabble survival knowledge their grandparents had. Ask a Soviet-era grandmother how to survive winter without electricity, and she'll give you an hour-long lecture filled with useful information. Ask her millennial grandson the same question, and he'll probably suggest ordering takeout before the power goes out. The knowledge is dying with the generation that needed it to stay alive. Soviet winter survival techniques weren't just about the cold. They represented a complete system of communal support, individual resourcefulness, and acceptance of harsh reality. These people survived conditions that would kill most modern humans within days. The thick concrete apartments, the layered clothing systems, the preserved foods, the communal living arrangements, the banya culture, all of it combined into a survival framework that kept millions alive through winters that would have killed them individually. Was it pleasant? Absolutely not. Did it work? And the fact that 300 million people survived Siberian winters year after year proves it did. So next time your heating bill seems high or your down jacket seems expensive, remember, Soviet citizens survived colder weather with less resources, worse infrastructure, and more government incompetence than you'll likely ever face. They didn't do it through superior technology or abundant resources. They did it through community cooperation, relentless ingenuity, and the understanding that winter doesn't care about your feelings. It only cares whether you're prepared to outlast it.